Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Monday edition of Point of View. And, of course, over the weekend was the remembrance of 20 years ago of 9/11. And I thought we would come back to that in sort of an indirect way by talking about those individuals still left behind in Afghanistan. That is our first article. We may come back to that topic the next hour because Dr. Michael Rydelnik will be with us. We'll actually be talking about his book, The 50 Most Important Bible Questions. I've picked out 8 that we'll maybe talk about in that hour, and you are free to ask some other questions. But since he was also part of that remembrance that took place last Friday, you might remember if you were listening, I believe it was on Thursday, we talked with Dr. Mitch Glazer about that. And, of course, also another person who was at that event will be with us Thursday. That will be, again, a very familiar individual to us as well, Joe Rosenberg. So we will probably get into a little of that this hour and a little bit next hour. But I want to also cover some other stories that are kind of in the background but very important. One of those has to do with the fact that we may or may not spend $3.5 trillion. Where are we going in that? What is that going to mean for you and your family, especially in an attempt to try to pay for this? A lot of people say, well, it's just going to be taxes on corporations and the wealthy, and so it's not going to affect me, and I'm going to try to explain to you how it will. But also we want to start looking ahead to the fact that we have a recall election taking place in California. And I know this would really surprise you, but they're having all sorts of election difficulties here. People having trouble casting ballots, certain people found with multiple copies of ballots, and all sorts of other things, which bring us back to one of the conversations we've had before of the issue of voter fraud, which we keep having people assure us does not take place. And yet you have already over these last few days coming up to this election some pretty significant things that don't seem right. So we'll talk about that as well. So we have a lot to cover in this first hour. As I said, it's almost kind of a Bible answer man next hour because Dr. Michael Rydelnik will be with us. He is with Moody Bible Institute, individual that actually grew up in a Jewish home and in some respects brings that understanding as well to both the Old Testament and how a Messianic Jew can address some of those topics. I think you're going to really find that a great conversation as well. But my first article is entitled Those Still Left Behind in Afghanistan. It comes from the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, and it illustrates a point that I try to make every once in a while. I even make it in our book on the biblical view of the liberal mind, because there tends to be this sort of mindset among those people that want a bigger and more expansive government to assume that government will be very efficient the bigger it gets. And yet, have you ever been to a place where you've had to get a driver's license, certainly various kinds of bureaucratic coverage. Maybe you had to deal with the Labor Department. Maybe you've had to deal with the Department of Commerce. Maybe you've had to deal with Veterans Administration. You recognize that sometimes bureaucracies move very slowly. And if you're at the Department of Motor Vehicles, it's just sort of frustrating because you have to wait longer. But if you're somebody behind the Taliban curtain right now in Afghanistan, it isn't just frustrating, it could be life-threatening. And so that's what this piece is all about. They said the Taliban has now finally let more than 100 Americans, Canadians, British, and U.S. permanent residents and a few others fly out of Afghanistan. That happened last week. The State Department said it expects more departures, but the Biden administration still isn't doing nearly enough, they say, to save thousands of Afghans who earned the right to immigrate to the United States. I'll explain that in just a minute, but let's go on with the piece here. Americans, U.S. residents, and endangered Afghans are still scattered throughout the country. The Taliban has effectively taken hundreds hostage at the airport in the northern city, that's Mazar Sharif, and some Americans have been told to travel to Kabul, but no one knows how they can do that safely. So imagine if you're stuck in the interior of Afghanistan, which, by the way, is a fairly good-sized country. If you have never looked at it on a map, you will begin to understand this. But let's talk about not only the U.S. citizens, which I hope will get out and will not end up being killed or held hostage for a long period of time, but there are some that are still there. But the bigger issue is that we have what is called the SIV program. What does that stand for? Special Immigrant Visa Program. This offers a pathway to citizenship, in this case for Afghans who worked with the American government for at least a year during the war. You know they will be targeted by the Taliban. If they worked with the government and have been vetted, they may make probably the best kind of citizens to have. But the process can take years, and you have hundreds of applicants and family members who have already been killed already in that regard. And the State Department acknowledged that the majority of SIV applicants remained after the U.S. forces departed. And this, as many people argue, and the editors of the Wall Street Journal argue, may be one of the worst wartime betrayals in U.S. history. By the way, this yesterday, when I was speaking to my own Sunday school class, I put up some various slides about, will people trust us in the future? Are we safer now? Those are, I think, important questions to ask. And will anybody trust us in the future, given the fact that we have been engaged in some kind of betrayal? One of the individuals they quote is the head of what is called No One Left Behind, which is an organization that is really working to bring some of those individuals out. Aware of about 200 approved SIV applicants and their families hiding throughout the country. They're fully vetted with paperwork in hand. They were told by the State Department to remain in place during the evacuation. Now the last American planes have left. So what do we do with those individuals? Organizations, they say, like No One Left Behind, have the financial wherewithal to pay for their flights out of the country, but they're at the mercy of the Taliban to actually get out. Thousands more, though, they point out, are still in one stage of, are you ready for this? It's a 14-step application process. Leave it to the federal government. 14-step application process, and they should have been evacuated as well. Politico reports only about 700 of those SIV applicants left during the evacuation. Of course, the rest are still there, as you well know. And the Taliban last week said it would only let foreign passport or visa holders leave the country. Okay, are the thousands of endangered Afghans supposed to wait for the process to play out from Washington, D.C., before they then get something that would actually be a passport? Again, I think you know what's going to happen there, and I just wanted to cover this. It's a very sad story, and last week we sent out a very poignant prayer list of things to pray for, and one of those is to pray for those behind the Taliban curtain right now in Afghanistan, and the need for us to be concerned about this. And I wanted to start with it, if for no other reason than you're probably not going to hear a whole lot about this in the media today, and yet we've left them behind. And as they've said, it may be one of the greatest betrayals from the American government in history. Very sad days indeed. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to talk about. We will right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Abortion is back in the news for a variety of reasons. This fall, the Supreme Court will hear the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization based on the Mississippi pro-life bill. Also, the Texas legislature passed a heartbeat bill that became law, and Nancy Pelosi announced that the U.S. House of Representatives will vote on the Women's Health Protection Act attempting to enshrine abortion law. Many of us feel like we've been here before. In 1992, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for Casey versus Planned Parenthood, but the court merely reaffirmed a modified version of the 1973 abortion decision of Roe versus Wade. In 2020, a Supreme Court appointed by two pro-life Republican presidents decided not to change the abortion law, yet there are some who believe that this time might be different. Charles Cook makes the case that the problem is Roe. The problem has always been Roe. It is not this or that law. It is not this or that precedent. It is not this or that state or legislature or governor. Why does he say that? Because legally Roe has always been utter nonsense, and because deep down we all know it. Listen to two pro-choice legal scholars. John Hart Ely argue that abortion decision was indefensible in every conceivable way that a Supreme Court decision could be indefensible. It was a super-protected right that is not inferable from the language of the Constitution. Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe observed, one of the most curious things about Roe is that behind its own verbal smokescreen, the substantive judgment on which it rests is nowhere to be found. Over the next few months, we will be hearing about abortion laws and rulings, but we might want to pause and consider that the original abortion decision of Roe is really the problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's see what we can talk about for just a few minutes voting there in the state of California. And it is once again a reminder of one of the things that we've talked about on this program so often, this issue of voter fraud. We are told by so many of the individuals that are part of the mainstream media or part of the activist groups that are actually suggesting that this is non-existent, or it certainly has not led to widespread voter fraud. And on my Wednesday commentary last week, I took on that argument that there's no evidence of widespread voter fraud, and that has never been the argument if you've really taken it seriously. I even give you the statement that everybody from Rush Limbaugh when he was alive to Barack Obama have all expressed doubt about widespread voter fraud. What was of concern was targeted voter fraud. And then I give you some facts and figures from Texas, because that's the latest state to be criticized for passing some election integrity laws. Those of you in Georgia know only so well how you have been attacked for that as well. But in the booklet that I produced last year on voter fraud, I just talked about the examples of voter fraud that existed in the Democratic primary, because I thought I don't even need to use other examples. There were Democrats accusing other Democrats of voter fraud, and oftentimes what you will hear is, well, this is just made up by Republicans because they want to engage in voter suppression. So what we have in California now is once again a reminder that even if you don't believe that there was intentional voter fraud, there are a lack of very significant attempts to make sure that people are not engaged in fraudulent activity, and even for those who maybe are not engaged in fraudulent activity, have an efficient system. As I've said before, if we were dealing with money and it was as slipshod as the way in which we allow people to vote, there would be lawsuits time and time again, because there is just, oh, well, it probably didn't make any difference anyway. And as I've pointed out, there are only some particular district attorneys that are even going to want to prosecute voter fraud. One, because it takes a lot of time, energy, and money. Number two, in some cases, once they prove fraud, it may not have overturned the election. And number three, once you prove voter fraud, sometimes the penalties are something like a slap on the hand, and when you've got other more serious cases before you, you just simply ignore it, and we've ignored it for too long. Some of this may not be fraud, it's just inefficiency or it's incompetence, but again, this is no way to run an election system. Let me just give you a few examples, and you can find lots of these, but I'm just going to pick one of these here put together by Jennifer Oliver O'Connell, in which you've had all sorts of voting issues in a high school in Woodland Hills, and some of the residents in the San Fernando Valley have had trouble casting their ballots. These are for a recall, by the way, in case you're not familiar with that, and they have been wrongly prevented from casting a ballot. Okay, what's going on? Well, some of them said that the computer showed that they had already voted. I love this. One person said, I'd like to know how I voted if I've already voted, because this is the first time I've walked in to vote. So either you have the computer is wrong, or there are people that are going out, finding people's names, going and voting in their place. Now, can you come up with any way that maybe you could prevent someone else from voting in your place? Voter ID comes to mind is one very good way to maybe prevent that from taking place, but given the fact that you don't necessarily have to do that in many states, you can see that is the case. Let me give you the list just from Los Angeles County. We have, for example, this Torrance, California drug addict who had 300 ballots in his car. You had an example there in Valley Village, stealing ballots out of mailboxes because she had access to one of the post office master keys. And you, of course, had other individuals who were told they could not vote because someone had already voted, so they filled out a provisional ballot, which may or may not be counted. And you can see, as this one individual said, Estelle Bender, I would still like to know how I voted. Indeed, it seems like some of this was happening on one particular side of the political aisle rather than the other. Okay. Los Angeles County Registrar's Recorder's Office said that in a statement that provisional ballots are a fail-safe option to ensure that everyone's votes are actually counted. And, of course, the argument is that if they actually would make a difference, they go back and count those provisional ballots. So we'll see where that takes us. But, again, you can see that much of this is, as this particular article points out, sort of the after-the-effect measures, which would matter much less if we had a front verification system of voter ID or signature match. The kinds of things that were required in the Georgia voter integrity laws and in the Texas voter integrity laws. And so we have, again, the same groups, Cal Matters, a number of others saying, well, it's just fake news to talk about all the kinds of examples of voter fraud. And again, I don't want to overplay it because it is quite possible that those aspects of what could be fraud or incompetence won't make a difference. But what if they do? What if the vote is really close and the recall vote actually could remove Gavin Newsom from the governorship? This would, of course, be really interesting. And at that point, if indeed he loses in the recall, which at the moment you have to assume may not take place, but if he does, I suspect all of a sudden we're going to hear all sorts of Democrats all up and down the state argue that voter fraud did take place. But as long as the candidate they like wins, then of course voter fraud is just an attempt of voter suppression. So did want to bring that up. Wanted to let you in California know we have been watching what's taking place there, and we'll see if that once again calls for us to maybe think seriously about doing a few things that would establish what we call voter integrity. One of the other articles I've posted here is on this $3.5 trillion spending goal that pretty much zoomed through the Senate and now is in front of the House, but again has to be re-ratified again by both the House and the Senate. And I won't get into all the technical details, simply to say that the article we've posted says that there's a growing realization among the Democrats that their plans for a $3.5 trillion spending package to reshape the nation's social safety net and to tackle climate change will have to be slimmed down because of anxious centrists. I'll talk about who those are in just a minute. This is something that is, by the way, different than the human infrastructure agenda that is part of that. And so some of these centrist Democrats that are both in the House and also in the Senate, that would be, of course, Joe Manchin and a couple of others. But in the House, some of these individuals are actually concerned that if they do ratify this, this would lead to what they call a political disaster in the 2022 midterm elections. Matter of fact, one strategist put it this way. You've got all these Democrats in the center who are quietly saying, I don't want to support the $3.5 trillion budget because who wants to run on that given the current climate? Have you seen the recent polls coming out of the states? And the answer is, well, yes, as a matter of fact. And one other factor is that President Joe Biden's approval rating has dropped precipitously. The latest Reuters poll has him with an approval rating of 47%, a disapproval rate of 46%. There are some that have had him actually upside down. And when you look at his approval ratings in several background states where we broadcast, that would be Arizona, Florida, Georgia, and North Carolina, trailing his disapproval rates by anywhere from 10 points to 14 points. And two of the toughest votes, of course, as I just mentioned, are going to be in the Senate. Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Kristen Sinema from Arizona. And so this is the case that there are a number of individuals that are really not sure that they want to actually walk the plank, vote for a $3.5 trillion budget. Especially when we talk about after the break, it is going to require incredible tax increases, which are always being said to only land on the rich. But I'll explain to you after the break how even if you don't consider yourself rich, it will affect you, if not directly, certainly indirectly. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. Then we'll move on to some other issues as well, because we have a lot to cover today. And don't forget, in about a half an hour, Dr. Michael Rydelnik will be with us. Looking forward to that interview as well. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you have some thoughts already about things we've talked about, that number is 1-800-351-1212. We'd love to hear from you, and we'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and maybe take some notes, because especially we're talking about right now something that tends to be a little bit boring. I understand when you talk about budgets, but what happens if you increase taxes on corporations, increase taxes on capital gains? What is that? How does that affect you and your family? Well, it's going to affect you in ways you probably do not understand, so I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Then I want to come to the the issue that I wrote about recently. As a matter of fact, this was, I think, the Monday commentary last week about China's cover-up. The fact is that after a lot of investigation, the United States concluded that we really don't know where the Wuhan virus came from, even though it came from Wuhan, and it couldn't possibly have come from the Wuhan Institute for Virology. Well, we have this huge data dump of 900 pages of documents on the work of EcoHealth Alliance, which I think just gives us one more indication of where we probably did get this virus and what it's going to mean to us in the future. And I also think that will bring us to one of the other articles I've posted here, that certain viewers are more accurate in terms of estimating the death risk from COVID-19. I know it's kind of gruesome, but it illustrates a point we've made before, and that is what you see, read, and hear needs to be done with a great deal of discernment. And we now can, I think, document rather dramatically, by the way, that certain people that watch certain cable news shows live in a very different world than others that watch other cable news shows, and all of those are even different than those who don't watch the cable news shows. So we'll get into that in just a minute. But let me finish off with this idea of a $3.5 trillion budget. Because in order to pay for this, there has been floating around, and the Washington Post and some others, I think I saw it in the New York Times, and I've got this one here that comes from one of the groups, looking at the taxes that will be increased, because the Democrats in the House of Representatives are proposing about $3 trillion in tax increases, including tax increases on small businesses. So if you have a small business, be concerned there, on working families. And this would be the largest tax increase since 1968. Now, for my younger listeners, you weren't even around in 1968. I remember it in 1968. But if you look at it in terms of comparing tax increase to the amount, you can see that this would be the largest tax increase ever in what we call nominal dollars. There are some ways in which this will affect you. First of all, there would be an increase in the corporate income tax rate from 21% to 26.5%. If you add that to the fact that many of you are actually in states that have some kind of state corporate tax, that would reach the level of 31%. I love what one person pointed out. The corporate tax rate for China is only 25%. So we would now have a tax rate in every state, but especially in the so-called blue states, that would be substantially more in the United States than in communist China. Get your head around that. Also, let's recognize that we don't really ever want to compare ourselves to communist China. We'd like to compare ourselves to other developed countries. I don't know, there'd be France and Germany, United Kingdom, Ireland, could be Hungary, could be Greece, could be Spain, could be, a number of countries like that. And those averages are about 23%. So you can see that right now there is a proposal to increase the corporate tax rate higher than anything else you see among most of the other developed countries, higher than what you have in China, communist China. And for those of you that are talking about a corporate tax rate in blue states, and I'm saying blue states in general because some of that isn't always true, that would be as high as 31%. You might say, well, we need to just stick it to those corporations. Okay, let's now start thinking our way through this for just a minute, because if you look at some of the research that has been done, and I'm pulling this from the Tax Foundation, they concluded that labor, or basically workers, that's you, bear about 70% of the cost of a corporate income tax. How do you do that? Well, that is how it affects your wages and other aspects of your employment, which could be some of your benefits. So obviously you increase the cost of what? The corporation. There are only a couple of ways we can do that. They can raise prices a little bit, but most of it is, well, we will reduce salaries, we will reduce benefits, and a number of other things. And so we find that it, first of all, affects the people that are working in the companies. And then they found that another about 31% of the corporate tax falls on the consumers, because then that raises the prices you have to pay. So again, corporations mostly don't have any money. They have to get it or save it in one way or another, and you end up paying for it. Let's take something else. If you raise the corporate income tax, it will also hit you in another way through higher utility bills, especially this coming at a time when the country is already trying to recover from the pandemic and the lockdown. And so, again, you can make a pretty good case that if you raise the corporate tax rate, you're essentially voting to raise the cost of utilities. And one other one I just thought I would mention is capital gains. Now, again, some of you may not have to think about capital gains, but if you have any kind of investment in the stock market, if not directly through your 401k or IRAs or whatever, you have to pay, indeed, if it has appreciated, capital gains. And that would be, again, raising the capital gains tax from basically up to 28.8%. Again, to put it in comparison, the capital gains tax in communist China is 20%. Well, I can go on and on, but I don't want your eyes to glaze over with numbers. But I do want you to understand that sometimes when we talk about those numbers, they affect your ability to pay your bills. And this is one of the reasons why, again, there seems to be a bit of a pause on the part of many individuals in Congress right now saying, we're not really sure we want to come up with a $3.5 trillion budget and then add to that and try to, quote, pay for it with a $3 trillion tax increase, which, by the way, if you've done your math, okay, if the taxes are $3 trillion and the cost is $3.5 trillion, first of all, we know that they're going to add all sorts of little gifts and ornaments on that Christmas tree before it's done. So it'll get a lot closer to maybe about $3.7 trillion. When I look at some of those things in even raising $3 trillion, there's a lot of wish and prayer in that. And so again, even raising the taxes as much as they want to raise still doesn't actually balance the budget. Isn't that just pathetic? But that's the world we find ourselves in right now. Just before we take a break, let me talk about China for a minute, because the other day I did a commentary, came out on September 7th, if you'd like to read it, in which I point out that there was an attempt to try to figure out what was the origin of the virus that we're all dealing with now. And the conclusion was, it's inconclusive. Now, to be fair, you did have one or two agencies that believed that one intelligence agency believed it maybe originated in the Wuhan Institute, at least two other agencies that thought it originated in animals. But over the weekend, we had something that is a shocker, and that is The Intercept, which is a news outlet, obtained more than 900 pages of documents detailing the work of the EcoHealth Alliance, which is the U.S.-based health organization that used federal money, which I believe actually was supported by Anthony Fauci, but we'll leave that to the side, to fund bat coronavirus research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. If you look at the documents, which are now available, you will find something rather striking. The people that are telling you to wear masks right now, turns out they weren't necessarily always using masks and wearing gloves when they were doing this research. At all the more reason causes me to believe that indeed this is where it came from. They had strict procedures, supposedly, in which they are supposed to use disinfectant, be wearing coveralls, have dedicated clothing, use certain kinds of gloves, eye protection, and N95 or N100 respirators. And the reality is they did not. And so some of the field work, especially while working in the caves, just full of fecal dust and all sorts of things that were taking place. So again, it's documenting, in a sense, what we already knew, but now we have it written out and recognizing that most likely that's where the virus came from. You will never get the Chinese government to apologize, and it seems like it's impossible to get the federal government to point a finger. But when we come back, I do want to talk just for another minute about this, because it turns out that some people that watch cable news have no idea what the death rate is for COVID-19. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, let me just ask you a question. And the question is a very simple one that Rasmussen was asking a lot of Americans, and they've done such a thorough study. I just think I will quote from them directly. And the question was simply this: what do you believe is the death rate from COVID-19? Is it less than 2%? Is it 2% to 5%? Is it 5% to 10%? Or is it more than 10%? It's not a trick question, by the way, because we do have all sorts of published data. The Journal of the American Medical Association says that the estimated fatality rate in the United States is 0.7%, less than 1%. You can obviously say it's a little difficult to determine because we don't know how many people have been infected, but most people use that number. The CDC, by the way, uses some other numbers. They say that if you're under the age of 17, the fatality rate is 0.002%. all the way up to maybe 9% for people age 65 and older, or if you have have better health and you don't have comorbidities, that percentage is much lower. And so anyway, the right answer would be less than 2%. 0.7%. Some people say it's about 1%. You can have a little bit of an intramural discussion about that, but the reality is about 30% of Americans said, yeah, it's less than 2%. Another 20% believed it to be between 2 and 5%. Another 17% thought it was in 5 to 10%. And you had almost 19% that thought it was more than 10%. I don't even know what world these people live in. But here's the point. It's not essential that you walk away from this program knowing the exact percentage of the fatality rate. What this illustrated was, because they not only asked the question of what do you think was the fatality rate, but where do you get your news and information? This is where we see a stark difference in news outlets. Because most of the viewers of what most people would call relatively conservative news outlets, that would be Fox News and Newsmax, were much more likely to accurately answer that question, whereas viewers of MSNBC, and probably the worst was CNN, were very inaccurate and least likely to answer that question. Now, does that mean that you should always watch Fox and Newsmax and never watch CNN? No, I mean, you can find all sorts of things that are right and wrong in any of that, but it does illustrate again that if your steady dose is CNN and MSNBC, you may not necessarily be perceiving the world quite as accurately. It would be fun if they had done enough surveys where they could ask if you listen to talk radio like Point of View and see how some of you listeners would have done. But I think you know where that would have come out as well. And at the same time, because some of these news outlets point out inconsistencies or errors or questions, I don't think it would surprise you also to find out that a very significant number of viewers of Newsmax or Fox tended to think that sometimes public health officials were lying, whereas when they ask, do you believe officials are lying about vaccine safety, that number was very, very low for CNN and MSNBC. It's posted so you can get all the numbers and look at it, but it's simply an attempt to remind you once again that whatever you see, read, and hear, have some level of discernment. But let's go to CNN for just a minute, because I do want to give some props to CNN. On Anderson Cooper's program the other day, you had a very interesting discussion, obviously, about the vaccine mandate. And in the midst of this, Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who is CNN's chief medical correspondent, asked a question that some of us around the table have been wanting people to ask Dr. Anthony Fauci for some time. And that is, you keep talking about this whole idea of vaccination, but what about the individuals that already have had the COVID disease? They've been infected and have recovered from it. And so Dr. Sanjay Gupta wanted to know why there was never any discussion about people with natural immunity. By the way, if you don't think this is politicized, over the last couple of days, writing for a commentary, I've gone to the Harvard Public Health website to look up some material having to do with this whole idea of vaccines and natural immunity. And I even went back to Nature magazine, which I pointed out on Friday, which have all talked about whether or not the COVID-19 would be endemic. And whether it's Nature, which is the prestigious scientific journal of the UK, or the Harvard Public Health, they all talk about natural immunity. You never hear the phrase natural immunity being brought up. So again, 3 cheers for Dr. Sanjay Gupta for saying, wait a minute, there is a recent study in Israel showing natural immunity to be 27 times more effective than the Pfizer vaccine. So should those people who have already been infected and recovered get the vaccine? How do you make the case to them? And the response from Dr. Anthony Fauci was, that's a really good point, Sanjay. I really don't have a firm answer to you on that. And then he added, well, there's something we're going to have to discuss regarding the durability of the response. Fauci then argued that the Israel study didn't really address the issue of the durability of natural immunity, which I think that it did, but okay, we'll leave that. And so he says it is conceivable that if you've got infected, you're protected, but you may not be protected for an indefinite period of time. Now, what has been so intriguing is the part left out is if you've looked at the August CDC results, they are already showing a significant decline in the immunity of fully vaccinated Americans. That has been remarkable in terms of what has happened to Pfizer, people that have been receiving the Pfizer vaccine, but also some of the Moderna vaccines, some of which now have had that for 8 months after their second dose, and why there's so much discussion right now about the idea of a booster, although I'm starting to see more and more people saying maybe we shouldn't go out and get a booster, but nevertheless, that is the case. And again, you can go to Science Magazine, that's the preeminent science journal for the United States, in which they said that they found a substantial immune memory generated after people were infected with COVID-19. So let's at least give credit to CNN in that particular case, asking a really important question that hasn't been asked, because if indeed you are convinced that these 80 million people that are unvaccinated pose a threat, as I pointed out on Friday, it's possible up to 40 million of those 80 million, could be more, could be less, don't know, because we don't necessarily always test those people, could actually have natural immunity, which actually, as far as we can determine, may actually be better than the artificial induced immunity that comes from the mRNA vaccine. Anyway, it's just one more reminder of the fact that just as a minute ago, you heard me talk about some of the failings of CNN, and the fact that people that watch that weren't very good at estimating the true COVID death risk. You probably would not have heard anywhere except on CNN, I think, a very good question from Dr. Sanjay Gupta to Dr. Anthony Fauci. And the reaction from Dr. Fauci was puzzling, almost like, gee, I've never really thought about that before, and that should be a source of some concern as well. Just before I take a break, let me just mention my commentary today is about abortion laws and rulings, and we might get around to talking about that later, but I am really looking forward to doing kind of a Bible answer man this next hour. I think very highly of Dr. Michael Rodenik, and he actually does Open Line on the Moody Broadcasting Network. His new book out, 50 The Most Important Bible Questions. I'm going to ask him 8 of mine, but if you've always had a question you wanted to ask a Bible scholar, I hope you'll call in as well. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time in just a few minutes talking about some of these Bible questions, but just before we have a chance to connect up with Dr. Michael Wadelnik, I thought we might come back to this idea of what we do or do not know from China. My commentary, as I mentioned last Monday, was trying to make sense of the intelligence community's response, and that is, you may remember that President Biden directed the intelligence community to investigate the origins of the virus from China. As I think most of us suspected when that first surfaced, the report was inconclusive. Now, to be fair, at least one thought that it probably did come from the Wuhan Institute for Virology. There's very good reasons to believe that. Why, out of all the places in China, did the virus come from there? And to argue that just so happens that it developed right in a wet market next to the highest security laboratory in China does strain a little bit of credulity. The fact that there were people that were in the institute that got sick, the fact that, as we've pointed out before, and I don't want to get too much into the deep weeds of science, but you have, if I remember right, and I don't have it in front of me right now, I think we have 4 positively charged amino acids next to each other, things that you just don't find naturally, that look more engineered. All of that would be certainly the case. And in the piece that I quoted from on Monday, Thaddeus McCotter said the outcome was foreshadowed at the start from a statement that came from the Director of National Intelligence, because she said, we're hoping to find a smoking gun, but it's challenging to do that. And, of course, it would be hard to find that smoking gun given the fact that the Chinese government, and I'm talking about the Chinese Communist Party, was doing all it can to cover up what was taking place. Now, as we pointed out before, there are a lot of reasons to argue that it did come from the laboratory, but even, as I said in the piece, you accept the fact that this was a natural occurring phenomenon. You should at least, I think, acknowledge the cover-up of China and the fact that they, as he points out, did everything they could in their power to suppress the truth about not just the origin, but the spread of the pandemic, and then to insulate itself from accountability. So from the very beginning, there was all sorts of pressure placed upon American elites to prevent anyone, including at that time President Donald Trump, from referring to that as the China virus or the Wuhan virus. Of course, anytime people raised any questions about where it may have come from or suggesting that maybe it did come from a lab leak or something like that, those were immediately dismissed as conspiracy theories and all the rest. And then just look at the incredible amount of pressure the communist Chinese government has been able to exert on the media and especially on business. I mean, you don't dare speak out against China if you're part of the NBA, if you're with Nike, if you're with various Fortune 500 companies. You hardly ever want to say anything that could be perceived as negative if you're part of what's called the mainstream press. And so all of that coming together was certainly part part of one of the issues that we certainly have tried to address before. And this recent data dump illustrates once again the lack of protective gear that was worn, the lack of protocols that were in many cases not used, and on and on. So there are some reasons to even now have more concern about the possibility that this came from the Institute. Just before we take a break, though, I thought I would pick up something else that we did post on Friday, but because we were focused so much on other stories, I never really got into it. And so that is the Friday commentary, which I referred to as the COVID spin. We've had two kinds of spin. Of course, we've had the spin that came from China, but we've had within this country a spin as well. And so if you go back to look at my commentary, we have a chart, which I did talk about the other day, which illustrates only so well that anytime somebody tries to put blame on one particular group, they are actually using their bias to reach a conclusion that the data does not allow. And the example I use comes from a commentary by Charles Cook, in which he actually breaks down based on the, if you will, death rate per 100,000, the COVID death rate for 100,000, which we just were talking about a minute ago, and then breaks it down by individual states, and then also colors the state either red or blue. By the way, I don't necessarily agree with all of those. I think, for example, Massachusetts ends up being red, and maybe because of the legislature, but more or less what you can see is a very interesting pattern, but no discernible pattern. And that is, you see some reds and you see some blues, you see a couple of reds together, you see some blues. And the point is, as he said in his opening statement, 2 presidents, 50 states, 195 countries, the multitude of approaches, and still there's no rhyme or reason to this pandemic. Because you would expect, listening to the spin that comes from so many people right now in the mainstream media, that the blue states would bunch up in one area of the chart, red states would bunch up in another. And if you listen to, for example, we just mentioned CNN and MSNBC, you'll hear them say that the red states are bad and the blue states are good. Or another writer with the New York Times said, well, that's not quite true. Really what it is, the North is good and the South is bad. And Charles Cook has some good responses to that. If that were the case, either one of these were the case, how could you possibly account for what he calls the death rate pinnings and pairings of New York and Mississippi, of Alabama and Connecticut, of Michigan and Arkansas, of Texas and Delaware, of Idaho and Colorado? Because you see what is not even a really discernible pattern. When you have more variation than you have a correlation, the correlation means nothing. And that's exactly what you have. You have some states that are with the worst kind of death rate per 100,000 that are blue, but you also have some red up there. Go all the way to the bottom. Yeah, you have some blue states that have a low death rate, but you have some red ones right next to it as well. And you have a lot of red ones right in the middle. And so as you look at this, you begin to see, there's just a lot of spin, a lot of political spin, not just from the Communist Chinese Party, but also from commentators who want to say this is all due to Trump supporters. It's all due to blue states. It's all due to red states. It's all due to the North. It's all due to the South. And you really cannot make those kinds of blanket statements. And I'm hoping that if nothing else, this will cause all of us to maybe have just a little more humility, maybe make a few less sweeping statements about the pandemic, and to recognize that almost all of the spin that has been used in so many commentaries over the last couple of months really have been proven to be false. So if you haven't had a chance to see my commentary on Friday, we didn't really have a chance to talk about it, and especially that chart, I think you might want to read it, maybe even post it, get some people to back off a little bit and stop making statements that you simply can't prove. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Abortion is back in the news for a variety of reasons. This fall, the Supreme Court will hear the case of Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization based on the Mississippi pro-life bill. Also, the Texas legislature passed a heartbeat bill that became law, and Nancy Pelosi announced that the U.S. House of Representatives will vote on the Women's Health Protection Act attempting to enshrine abortion law. Many of us feel like we've been here before. In 1992, the Supreme Court heard oral arguments for Casey versus Planned Parenthood, but the court merely reaffirmed a modified version of the 1973 abortion decision of Roe versus Wade. In 2020, a Supreme Court appointed by two pro-life Republican presidents decided not to change the abortion law, yet there are some who believe that this time might be different. Charles Cook makes the case that the problem is Roe. The problem has always been Roe. It is not this or that law. It is not this or that precedent. It is not this or that state or legislature or governor. Why does he say that? Because legally Roe has always been utter nonsense, and because deep down we all know it. Listen to two pro-choice legal scholars. John Hart Ely argued that abortion decision was indefensible in every conceivable way that a Supreme Court decision could be indefensible. It was a super-protected right that is not inferable from the language of the Constitution. Harvard professor Lawrence Tribe observed, one of the most curious things about Roe is that behind its own verbal smokescreen, the substantive judgment on which it rests is nowhere to be found. Over the next few months, we will be hearing about abortion laws and rulings, but we might want to pause and consider that the original abortion decision of Roe is really the problem. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I'm not going to be able to have Dr. Michael Rydelnik with us today. His book is entitled 50 Most Important Bible Questions, but if you were looking forward to a few of those, I thought I was recommended maybe I could answer a few of those, and that's something I do. So one of those questions was early on in his book, why does it seem like there are two separate and contradictory creation stories in Genesis? And that is one of the questions I get with some regularity, because if you go to a religion class at the university, they'll say, well, the Bible's just full of contradictions, and the first contradiction you find when you open the Bible up, and that is you have Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and they look very, very different. And so obviously this just shows that the Bible is full of contradictions because it says two very different kinds of things. Now, he does point out that there's a literary structure, and given his Jewish background, when we do get him on next month, we will let him go into it in more detail. But the allegation is that you have two different names for God. In Genesis 1, you have Elohim, and in the second, you have Yahweh, or Yahweh Elohim, or Lord God. And so, first of all, you have two different names for God. You have a differing order of creating the vegetation, and you have a different order of creating animals and humans. So how do we answer that that question? Well, first of all, if you go and pull out your book and go to Genesis, you will see that it gives you a series of days that are actually chronological. And it says there was the first day and second day and evening, morning, then the second day, third day, fourth day. So it is very definitely, that is Genesis 1, written in a chronological order. It actually, and I will leave this to Michael, get into more of the detail, according to what is oftentimes in English called an consecutive, order is important. A good illustration of that would be, I got up this morning, my wife and I went for a walk, came back and had breakfast, took a shower, got dressed, drove to the office. Their order is important, and so obviously that is the case. Elohim, of course, is also referring to God's power, and so the name of God in Genesis 1 makes a great deal of sense, because it is the creation of what? The creation of the cosmos. And so that is very significant indeed. But then, interestingly enough, once you go to that, we then go to Genesis 2. And Genesis 2 is more in what sometimes we call an copulative state, and that is where order isn't important. I went to the grocery store and I got some bananas and I got some apples and I got some bread and I got some milk. Is order important there? No. And that is the construction that you have in Genesis 2. And there, what is the focus of all of that? Well, the focus is really a truncated view of creation and a focus primarily on the most significant aspect of that creation, and that is the creation of Adam and Eve, of human beings. There's another way to think about this from even a scientific point of view. I don't know how many of you in the listening audience ever had a chemistry class, but I remember this only so well from both chemistry in high school and in college, and that is you would actually write up the various things you did in the chemistry lab this way. You would first start by talking about everything you did in the order you did it. I mix these two reagents together. I put them through a filter. I put them on a Bunsen burner, on and on and on. And so you would actually, in Genesis 1, if you will, or in the description of that chemical experiment, talk about the order. Order would be very important, and that is what you basically have in Genesis 1. But then when you finish describing the order in which you did the chemical reactions, you would then summarize what happened. What were the products? What were the reagents? What was the ultimate result? What was actually produced by that? And in some cases, especially if you're in organic chemistry, you would mix chemicals together and get something that smells like banana because they're esters and all sorts of things that you would then begin to describe, or things that you begin to do with pH and all the rest. And so if you can see how we do that right even to this very day, when we, for example, do a physics experiment or a chemistry experiment or something like that, the first section is where it is in order and chronological. The second is the summary of what took place. In a sense, that's exactly what you have with the two names of God and the order of creation. Elohim is, again, the God of power. It's used in Genesis to show God's power in creating the world. Yahweh Elohim is actually God's relational name, and that is the fact that actually God was creating human beings in his image with whom he would have a relationship. Maybe Michael will do a better job of answering that question, but that's one in the book. Let me jump to another one here. Does the Old Testament predict the Messiah, or is this just an idea invented by the New Testament authors? And a lot of that goes into a booklet I'm holding up right now, which we produced a while back on Messianic prophecy, in which we point out that you have some very clear prophecies in the Old Testament which were obviously applied to the Messiah. But I think there's also the possibility, as we talked about fairly recently with J. Warner Wallace, that some of them were a little bit more masked in terms of that didn't necessarily, when the prophet spoke that and was moved by the Holy Spirit to express that, actually knew that that was going to be applied to the Messiah. And so the next chapter in his book then actually talks about specific Old Testament predictions that reveal Jesus to be the Messiah. And I'll go through these fairly quickly. Of course, where he would be born, the nature of him as well, a whole lot about the Messiah's death and resurrection and return. And even in our little booklet on Messianic prophecy, we try to take you through some of these and even show how something as simple as the lineage that is written down by Matthew in the Gospel of Matthew and also written down by Luke in the Gospel of Luke are important, because we see that as we look at the lineage, the Messiah would be a descendant of Abraham. We see that in Genesis 22. The Messiah would be a descendant of Isaac. We see that in Genesis 17 and 21. The Messiah would be a descendant of Jacob. We see that in Genesis 28. We see also, of course, that he would be a descendant of Judah, not the other 11 brothers of Jacob. Then we even further on see that the Messiah would be a descendant of Jesse in the tribe of Benjamin, and the Messiah would come from the house of David. We see that in 2 Samuel, Jeremiah 23, Psalm 89. So even something as seemingly almost indescript as the lineage, do we see that? But then, of course, the birth of the Messiah in, of course, Bethlehem, the timetable of the Messiah, which Dr. Radelnik gets into in a little more detail, and then so many events surrounding the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus are all issues that we talk about so significantly, because some of them, especially when you look at Zechariah, that he would be riding on a donkey, that he would be betrayed by 30 pieces of silver, not gold, that these actually would be cast on the floor of the temple, that it would be used to buy a potter's field. So many of these are so incredibly specific that we do spend some time talking about the prophetic probability of any of those is pretty significant. So if you don't get Michael Radelnik's book, you might want to get a free copy of our one on the Messianic prophecies, because we spend some time going through some of those and even giving you some other books and resources that we think very highly of that might actually give you some more information. The ones I recommend are by Dr. D. James Kennedy on the Messiah, Tim LaHaye's The Greatest Prophet, Chapter 5, and Jesus, What the World is Still Fascinated About Him. And of course, probably the best place to find a lot of these prophecies by Josh McDowell and Sean McDowell in the book Evidence That Demands a Verdict. Chapter 9 goes into that in incredible detail. But if you want to read the short version, it's available in our booklet. And of course, we have some really great insights from Dr. Michael Radelnik. Sorry we couldn't have him on today, but we will get him in the future, and we will use that as a Bible Answer Man question opportunity, and maybe between now and then you can think of some questions you might want to ask him. I've already answered 2 of his 8 that I was going to use, and when we come back we'll get into a couple other issues that you need to talk about and know about, but we'll be back right after this.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach. by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, at Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Perhaps you've seen the sign that says, grammar saves lives. And, of course, one of the examples they use is whether or not you have a comma, because there's a difference between let's eat, comma, grandma, and let's eat grandma. You understand that only so well. And I thought of that when I came across this article, because I was looking at an aggregator site, which tends to be a little more left of center, and I read it, and it said, let's stop pretending America's in peril. And so I'm looking at it and thinking, okay, this is probably going to be an article that I might even want to read just to see maybe they're arguing that actually we're not in peril. All these crises that are allegedly part of the Biden administration aren't really crises, which, first of all, I think would be a hard argument to make, but I'm always up for a good argument. When I get to it, I realize, no, there's a period there. It's let's stop pretending, period. America's in peril. So, okay, it was going the other direction, but it was a very good piece. I haven't posted it today, but you can find it. It's by Will Alexander, and he starts out by talking about Russell Conwell, who, by the way, I just finished writing the most recent booklet, and I almost quoted him because Russell Conwell wrote this book called Acres of Diamonds. He was actually a pastor as well, did a sermon on it, then became a book. But even so, he talks about Russell Conwell, who was actually a captain in the 46th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment during the Civil War. But unlike so many that served in the military, he actually did have a chance to meet Abraham Lincoln face to face. And in the book, he talks about visiting Lincoln in the White House to plead for the life of one of his young soldiers who'd been sentenced to death. And anyway, I won't go into all the details there, but he wanted to make sure that this 17-year-old would not be hanged because of the fear that he showed in Antietam. So I understand about that. But then, instead of being done, Abraham Lincoln, in the basically the Oval Office at that time, asked the commander, this would be Captain Conwell, how it was going on the field. And he admitted, well, we sometimes get discouraged. And Abraham Lincoln said, well, it's all right. We're going to win. And then after talking about that, they spent some time talking about family and farm and all that. And then Abraham Lincoln picked up a roll of paper and said, good morning, which is kind of just hint to leave. Cornwell then talks about days later, he saw Lincoln again, but this inside now a coffin in the East Room after he had been assassinated. And so it was interesting to talk about that, and he uses that as an example of why he is convinced that we are still in a very dangerous set of circumstances. So I thought I'd read the last part of Will Alexander's piece, because he takes essentially a page and a half to get to what we're going to get to right now, telling some other stories about Abraham Lincoln and the rest. But he says, ultimately, today, America is in the greatest peril of all its history. The task rests on us greater than that which rested on Washington and Lincoln combined. We feel it. Good times have produced leaders who shrink from making the hard decisions that tough times demand. I thought of Lincoln as I watched the 9/11 remembrances in Saturday. In 20 years, this look back was the strangest, he says, of them all. Amid the sights and sounds of name reading and survivor stories, it was impossible to block out the sights and sounds of President Biden's botched Afghanistan pullout, the crowning catastrophe of all of his disasters. So Will Alexander goes on to say, the most infuriating sight, he said, for me was to see three presidents, he names them, basking in the somber glory of the day. He says these men, more than anyone, could have spared America the shame, the disgrace, and the peril we now feel. At critical junctures, they chose to coddle the cancer they still are. Then he quotes from Lieutenant Colonel Robert Buzz Patterson. This is an individual we've had on the program with us. He is the individual who carried the nuclear codes for at this time, of course, it was Bill Clinton, and he wrote about that in a book that we also did an interview on. We interviewed him before he wrote the book and then after he wrote the book, called Dereliction of Duty, came out in 2003. And it was just sort of eye-opening for all of us to hear Buzz Patterson talk about, first of all, the mouth that Hillary Clinton had, which wasn't a big surprise, but also just the general lack of interest on the part of Bill Clinton. Anyway, he talks about in the book, and this is where Will Alexander focuses on, how at that time President Clinton, who was golfing, squandered a golden opportunity to kill Osama bin Laden when the military had tracked him down, had him in their sights, and awaited their orders, which never came. And we've talked about this on the program as well. So then Buzz Patterson in his book said, in 8 years of office, President Clinton's military response to the terrorist threats was negligible and did nothing to seriously address the problem, instead following a de facto course of drift which allowed the terrorist network to grow in size and strength. Because of the criticism that very quickly was leveled at George W. Bush, because people disagreed with this, that, or the other that he did, I think there were times in which the inattention, it's probably a nice way to say it, of President Bill Clinton was able to sort of get off scot-free. But then Will Alexander's not finished. He says President Obama in 8 years reduced the war on terror to a man-caused disaster, reduced Islamic extremism to merely extremism, labeled Nidal Hassan's killing at Fort Hood as a workplace violence rather than a terrorist act, softened the rules of engagement in favor of the enemy, something we've talked about many times in this program, created a vacuum for Iraq for ISIS, and used America's resources to travel the Muslim world apologizing for America's supposed historic arrogance. And then, of course, he leaves the rest to President Biden. And he talks about, of course, how President Biden botched the pullout, botched the border, botched policing, botched race relations, botched the voting system, botched COVID response, and is botching the economy. That's just a short list, but you get the idea. So he said, if Lincoln asked me today, how's it going in the field? He says, like Conwell, I would admit I sometimes get discouraged. But we can't afford to be discouraged. He says, in my 20 years as a Marine, I learned that war tends to make its own course as it unfolds. It's a test of wills. Whoever loses the will to win loses the war. He says, we did not lose this war. The war is not over. We lost a monumental battle. These maniacs, drunk on the liquor of their victory, will not stop. Biden's botched pullout created historic vulnerabilities that have made our enemies stronger than they were 20 years ago. We can't wish this stuff away. The foreign and domestic perils are happening. We have no choice. They came to us. We cannot allow our children and grandchildren to live in the world where people are aggressively working to create without us firing a shot. Like Lincoln, we must face the peril, postpone our onion planting, because he talked about how the plan for Abraham Lincoln was to go and get a farm and plant onions and use the mules to do all of that. While we're in the midst of a disaster, we're going to win. As long as we have the mindset, the how will come. He's maybe even a little more optimistic than some of us around the table tend to be, but it is a reminder that he says we've got to stop pretending the America that we know is in peril. The conversations that we've had, and I had a chance to hear Joel Rosenberg, who, by the way, will be with us on Thursday by phone, not in studio, but the comments he made and the comments that were made before he came and spoke even in our own church was that these military have kept us safe. For all the people that have called the Veterans Administration suicide hotline wondering, what good did I do? Well, what good you did is we've not had another attack on American soil in the last 20 years. But are we safer now than then? And I'm not so sure that we are. We have been safe up until this point, but we lost a very significant and strategic forward operating base when we left out of Bagram Air Force Base, and now it is going to be much more difficult for us to monitor terrorist activity. It's going to be much easier for terrorist networks to develop within a Taliban kingdom, and it's something to think about. And of course, don't forget the armaments. Interesting, when we post the picture, immediately there are fact checkers saying, well, this is partially false. And the implication is, well, some of that equipment has been destroyed, some of it is old. Very true. But we also Don't even have to have military intelligence to see the YouTube videos of armored personnel carriers and Humvees making their way down Kabul, where Taliban are driving them, to know that we have armed them in significant ways. And so in some respects, we have to be even more vigilant. And it doesn't appear right now that those people in positions of authority are. So if you need a prayer target, that's it. Pray for those in authority, those individuals that were responsible for the withdrawal from Afghanistan and have to plot the future for America. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes, and let me just give you a preview of tomorrow. We're going to be talking with J. Warner Wallace. His book is now out, called Person of Interest. Such a good book, which is much more than you might imagine. It is certainly kind of apologetics and how to make the case for, indeed, the deity of Jesus Christ, the authority of the Bible, and much more. But because of the way in which he does it, it also takes you through architecture, art, history, literature, very well done, and really almost kind of his opus. So you will certainly enjoy the conversation we'll have with him tomorrow, and also we'll get back into some of the issues in the news. Just before we wind down today, let me also mention my commentary today is entitled Abortion Laws and Rulings. First of all, as I've mentioned before, we have these booklets that we make available. This one on abortion, I mentioned last week when we had our Council for Life women in studio, because was what I did was take some of the material that I used when I was educating some of the younger version of Counsel for Life on how to kind of make the case for life. Arguments, obviously they're biblical arguments, but also what are medical arguments, legal arguments, philosophical arguments for life and against abortion. So that is available, and the commentary really deals with a couple of issues. First of all, of course, you have the Supreme Court that's going to hear this case called Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization based on the Mississippi pro-life bill. Also, of course, you have Texas, which passed a heartbeat bill that actually became law, and so you have the Justice Department wanting to bring suit against Texas on what grounds I do not know. I think there is going to be a real significant attempt to try to push that forward, but there will probably be brought to some fairly quick conclusion when judges say, who are you suing? You're trying to sue people that aren't even actors in this, but we'll see where that goes. And then, of course, now that we have Congress in session, U.S. House of Representatives will vote on the Women's Health Protection Act, which is an attempt to try to legalize Roe versus Wade, which might pass the House, will never pass the Senate, but we'll see. We'll see where all that goes. And so that is the case. And a lot of you may be somewhat skeptical, and I think you have every reason to do so, because as I point out in the commentary, we've been here before. We remember back, those of us that are older, in 1992, when you had a Supreme Court that you thought might use this in the Casey versus Planned Parenthood to actually do something, but basically what the Supreme Court did was just reaffirm a different version, if you will, of the 1973 decision of Roe versus Wade. Then you have 2020, when you had a Supreme Court which had actually a number of individuals that were justices appointed by two pro-life Republican presidents, which then decided not to change the abortion law. This time might be different. We don't know, but I do give you some quotes, even from pro-choice legal scholars who acknowledge that this decision known as Roe versus Wade was a flawed decision. Lawrence Tribe, who is hardly an individual that would agree with a whole lot that we talk about around this table, professor at Harvard, basically said it's just a verbal smokescreen. There's really nothing there. So I wanted you to know about that and wanted to spend some time encouraging you to read that and maybe think about posting it and trying to have conversations with individuals to show them the value of life and how, in some respects, whether you look at medicine and science or law or even just basic logic, philosophy, not to mention scripture, the case can be made for life. Just before I run out of time, I thought I'd mention the fact that most of the people in positions of authority recognize that they can't continue to if you will, try to deceive you about the inflation rate. And that is, you have the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell saying, I think inflation is temporary, but you're now seeing more and more individuals that are starting to acknowledge that, no, it probably is going to be around for some time. And so you have, for example, the New York Fed's survey of consumer expectations, in which they found that the respondents were saying that they expected inflation to be up by 4% in 3 years, and the fact that the inflation rate has increased to 5.2% illustrates that their own surveys now are showing that you know pretty much what is up, and that is we're going to be engaged in inflation for some time, and that's something that has caused many of us around the table to want to maybe do a little bit more to talk about economic issues. Of course, I have a book on economics, but we've also published over these years a couple of booklets that I thought might be very helpful to you. One on the subject of debt. And in that booklet, I spend some time not only talking about consumer debt, but also the federal debt. And as we had a very good conversation the other day with Chuck Bentley of Crown Financial, he says, we really can't criticize the federal government for going into debt when most of us as Americans are in debt. The scriptures are very clear. Proverbs 22:7 says, the rich rule over the poor, and the borrower is a servant to the lender. Some of the translations, I think, more accurately say the borrower is a slave to the lender. And so we recognize that. Psalm 37, verse 21, the wicked borrows and does not pay back, but the righteous is gracious and gives. So there are some very important passages that remind us of the danger of debt. And so the first obvious implication is to get out of debt. But I also have a booklet we've produced more recently, and this is a booklet on a biblical view on money management, in which we talk a little bit about issues like giving and savings and debt and even investing. And so that booklet is available. And for those of you that actually have been supporting this ministry, or as we get to next week, our Truth Team, we also make available other booklets, and one that will be coming out is one on the subject of money. And this goes into the history of money, talking about the fact that we are now in a situation 50 years after Richard Nixon closed the gold window and took us off of the gold standard. For some of you younger listeners, there was a time when we used to say the dollar was as good as gold, but it's not now. I mean, literally, you could go into a bank back in the 1950s, even back in during the 1960s until it stopped, and actually exchange your dollars for gold. But once that window was closed, we now, of course, are in a situation in which there has been more and more money printing, and that's one of the reasons we've put this one together, because we recognize we're in sort of uncharted territory, and we've talked about that with Chuck Bentley, and we'll be talking with him next week in Truth Team about that. So I want you to know that we always want to cover stories that affect you and your family, and we do actually see on the horizon some economic turmoil that we need to pay attention to, and will continue to do so here on Point of View. But let me, just before we run out of time, mention the fact that we've got a number of resources that we have put together for you. The first, of course, is my Viewpoints commentary on abortion laws and rulings. We also have a Take Action item. I've mentioned it before, but perhaps some of you have not taken the time to contact your 2 United States senators about H.R. 4, which is an attempt to pretty much change the election laws of America by putting incredible amount of power in the hands of the Justice Department. And if you find yourself saying you have covered a lot of topics, but I'd like to read some of those articles are available on everything from Afghanistan to some of the problems casting ballots in the recall election, to a $3.5 trillion budget, to the fact that some people that watch certain cable news outlets really don't understand the world very well. And all of those articles are available to you on our website at pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew for his help behind the scenes, and Steve as well. We look forward to our conversation with J. Warner Wallace tomorrow, and we'll see you then.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.